You know, Sucker Punch is one of those companies I can't find a single blemish. Whereas Naughty Dog and Insomniac Games have their fair share of misses, Sucker Punch's small catalog has benefited them in the sense they have more quality titles that make up for their minimal quantity. But, of course, we're here to talk about what is considered to be their more mature series, inFamous. Now, it really is interesting to note how this and the Prototype series were the only unlicensed superhero games, at least to my knowledge. With games such as these in the late 2000s and early 2010s, you would have thought we could have gone through an unlicensed superhero phase akin to what happened with 3D platformers. But this obviously wasn't the case, and with the advent of Second Son, both the unlicensed superhero genre and the inFamous series were never touched again. And that's a real shame considering the note inFamous 2 left on. Whether it be the open-ended conclusion or the satisfying gameplay mechanics, inFamous 2 definitely brought the unlicensed superhero genre to a whole new level, and possibly could have sparked an interest in making more of these types of games. Or is that really the case? Does inFamous 2 soar to new heights as a PS3 classic, or does it get clobbered down by its own issues? Previously, I thought inFamous 2 was a shining gem without a single stain. However, after playing it 6 times, I can conclude that it has its fair share of roughness. Now, of course, this doesn't prevent inFamous 2 from being the stellar game most people claim it to be. However, I do think it's worth discussing some of the issues that a lot of people don't like to bring up. Well, that's enough of me rambling on. So sit back, relax, and buckle up as we dive deep and reevaluate inFamous 2. The game opens with Cole giving a narration of everything leading up to the beginning of the second installment. Basically, he is preparing to face the beast, and he needs new powers from a scientist named Dr. Wolf in order to combat it. However, while he, Zeke, and a CIA agent Lucy Quo were preparing to take off, the beast decides to prematurely attack Empire City. His introduction really demonstrates the threat he poses. He's barely visible before he knocks Cole backwards with a truck, and then, as the smoke clears and Cole gets to his feet, he reveals his face. But of course, Cole doesn't run. He literally drains all his power to take it down. And when all is said and done, the beast simply puts itself back together as if nothing happened. And this was after Cole blasted his face with missiles and let down a hell of a thunderstorm. The game really sells the strength and power of the beast, and he's a villain Cole needs to take seriously. Ultimately, the story does a solid job at moving from plot point to plot point. For some time, the beast fades from the spotlight to be replaced with the conflict presented by Joseph Bertrand, but he still has a presence within the main story, as seen with how the game constantly reminds you how close he is to New Marais. One of the aspects the game does a very good job at is introducing a small plot element that becomes a big deal later on. For instance, the plague is mentioned recurringly as seen with the many dead bodies within the graveyards. It's not clear how this plays a major factor regarding the beast of the militia. However, later on you learn that the plague is caused by the racier radiation, and that the reason the beast was going on his rampage was because he was trying to save as many conduits as possible before they succumbed to the plague. It's these kinds of details that make inFamous 2 feel like a more complex plot. While it begins like a typical good versus evil narrative, it turns into a story centered around saving the greater few versus the lesser majority, as seen with the final karma choice. While the story hits all the right beats, the characters are a mixed bag. As the main protagonist, Cole McGrath is much more mature than he was in the first game. Whereas the original game had Cole mostly being unsure of himself, the second game puts a lot of emphasis on his newfound confidence, which indicates he has a better understanding of his identity and how to use his powers. Let's look at this one part where he's about to face a devourer. While Mr. LaRoche runs like a chicken, Cole holds his ground. It demonstrates how he doesn't cling onto the bad things he went through, like losing Trish, and has the ability to move on. It's a respectable character trait that exemplifies Cole's stoicism, but in that stoicism, there lacks a conflict. There was a lot of missed potential with the karma system. Contrary to the impression this game tries to give, there isn't really much of a choice when it comes to the decisions Cole makes because they all lead to the same result. Whether he chooses to use the tram to smash into the plantation or free the cops, the result of him freeing Quo is the same. Regardless of whether he chooses to work more with Nix or Quo, he still patches things up with Zeke nonetheless. It would have been a lot more interesting if Sucker Punch had tried to make differences in the character interactions depending on the decisions Cole made. For instance, If Cole had chosen Nyx's plan of having her pose as a militia figure while he went on an ass-kicking spree, maybe LaRoche would have felt more uneasy around Cole. Maybe if Zeke had informed LaRoche of what Cole had done, he would have backed away from him. In fact, if Cole continuously went along with Nyx's choices, Zeke probably wouldn't have reconciled with him very easily, which would have created a conflict within Cole involving how much control his evil half had over him. The only time the game actually demonstrates he's struggling with something is when he learns that the RFI Dr. Wolf gave him is actually a device designed to kill all conduits, but this is at the very end of the game. I wish there had been more moral dilemmas such as these for Cole to wrestle with, because as it stands, a lot of the karmic choices do little to influence his character. Also, as a side note, there's this subplot where whenever Cole absorbs a blast core, he seems to lose a lot of power. It almost looks like the blast core is killing him. It's not really explained why this is the case, almost as if there was meant to be a plot line behind this, but it never came to fruition. But moving on to Zeke, he's probably the character who has received the most improvement. In the first game, he was the fat guy that just got in the way all the time. Now he's a much stronger force to be reckoned with. He dons on militia gear and spies on them in order to gain information. So this time he actually helps Cole and the gang in situations, instead of whining about how he doesn't have any powers. I mean, dude, just ask Quo. Having powers isn't everything.
Look at what it did to me! I am a freak! Do you think I wanted this?
But anyway, not only is he much more capable, but he's also able to brush off old errors like nothing happened. Just take a look at the scene where he states he's spying on the militia. Zeke simply dismisses Cole's suspicions as water under the bridge. He doesn't even seem all that shaken by his tone. Later, after they reconcile, it's followed by one of my favorite scenes, in which the two of them are sitting together sharing a beer while watching TV. There's no dialogue, it's just a small slice of life and the otherwise chaotic adventure the two of them share. Ultimately, Zeke really goes through a lot of character development compared to his past self, and has quite the redemption arc. inFamous 2 also introduces two new conduits to the mix, Lucy Quo and Nyx. To start with the former, Quo doesn't really have a backstory, so while we know she represents the good karma side, we don't really understand why she's like that. Maybe some of the dead drops tell a few things regarding her time working with John White and Dr. Wolf, but Sucker Punch really couldn't be bothered trying to add a backstory for her in the game, which is strange because they were able to do that for Nyx. Eventually she gets powers when Bertrand captures her and activates her conduit gene, but it's all done off screen. So when Cole says they filled her with God knows what, we're not completely sure what it is that they pumped her with. Why should I care? It doesn't help that she's a bland, boring character, which reflects the strict, rigid person she is that's closed to new ideas. Nyx, on the other hand, is a much better developed character. She actually has a backstory expanded to the player, detailing that she was born in poverty and watched Bertrand wipe out her entire family, which explains why she tends to lean towards the side of evil. She has a lot more energy compared to the jaded Quo, which makes her more fun to be around. There's also a lot more charisma between her and Cole. In fact, there are times when it feels as if Cole is leaning more towards Nyx's decisions based on certain pieces of dialogue.
We get it going real fast, we ram it through the front door, and boom!
Fire will make a great diversion.
You want a new power? How about one of mine? How about I get one of yours, huh? No!
Hey, you gotta admit, it makes sense to swap powers. The stronger we are as a team, the more we get done.
I think this is in part because of the fact that the devs intended to make the evil ending canon. Ultimately, Nyx is just an all-around better character compared to Quo. In fact, I wouldn't really say that Nyx is necessarily evil per se. Her ways just feel more destructive based on how she wants to do things. It feels more like a distinction between order and chaos. But Nyx and Quo are at least halfway decent compared to Mr. LaRoche. This guy is supposed to be the leader behind the resistance against the militia. But for quite a few of his scenes, he's often depicted as being either very demeaning or really flirtatious. It's weird because when people talk about him, it feels like he's made to be a big deal, but actually meeting him will reveal he's a joke. Just look at the scene where his daughter gets mad at him. He always knew what was happening to her, but did jack shit. But then there are other scenes that show many other shitty traits. He hints at there being a cure for the plague, but then when you meet up with him, he admits there probably isn't a cure at all. He's also the guy that forces you to do favors for him before he gives you the prize, as seen when he refuses to give you a blast core until you blocked all the wells. Like, why is this guy in charge of anything? Sucker Punch, could you at least try? Give LaRoche some noble characteristics. Allow me to respect this dude and the organization he's creating to beat the militia. Instead, it just makes me yawn that they're making the resistance be run by an old, out-of-touch boomer. But that's enough me shitting on LaRoche. We finally get to the big bad of the story, which is none other than Joseph Bertrand. Now, on the surface, Bertrand is simply a mutant phobe preaching about his hatred towards Conduits. But the real twist is that he himself is one. Then again, there are a lot of homophobic people who are secretly gay. Ultimately, he was so frustrated with his self-image. Instead of turning into a golden Superman, he just ended up becoming a 50-foot maggot. This pissed him off so much, he associated this same ugliness to other conduits as well. His evil plan of shipping man-made conduits to start a global arms race is generic, but at least it allows him to provide some sort of stakes to the plot besides being a bigot. Generally, his whole identity of being a conduit while hating on others like him is a more interesting motivation. Unfortunately, Bertrand's psychology isn't really explored all that much, which is a damn shame because as it sits right now, he's just a caricature of a stereotype. And last but not least, we have John White. Unlike Bertrand, he's not black and white evil. We don't initially understand why he's causing a rampage across the world as the Beast. However, as the plague starts to become more of a running plot line, it's revealed that he's trying to activate as many conduits as possible, as they were the best chance of surviving the plague. Ultimately, he's an example of a misunderstood anti-hero. He's well-intentioned with his reasoning, but his plans would kill the millions who don't have the gene, which includes Zeke. Even though John might not have as much of a presence as he did during the first inFamous, the few scenes he's in creates enough of an impact in the same way that the few scenes of Senator Armstrong create a meme. Even though he didn't appear for that many scenes, he's still important to the story by relaying the themes on how not everything can be divided into good and evil. Sometimes some individuals are gray in their morality, and John represents that in his ideals to save people. He is in many ways the reverse of Bertrand, in that while Bertrand was a handsome man who was a monster on the inside, John is a beast that has every intention to do good based on his own morality. And speaking of good and evil, we might as well move on to the gameplay systems, namely the karma choices. As Cole makes one choice over the other, a meter will fill up, which will eventually allow him to surpass different ranks. As Cole moves up or down, he'll get different sets of powers as he continues in that karmic state. If there's one difference inFamous 2 makes from the original, it's that the choices are now separate missions. While in the first game, the decisions were just little instances that didn't affect the gameplay much, inFamous 2 makes them individual tasks. Now, there is one exception to this when Cole has to blow up the machine at the swamp, and he either gets scolded or praised by Quo, although that's kind of an isolated incident in the sense the game never makes you do something like this again. Most of the time, there are two courses of actions Cole can take to get a desired result. In order to help the resistance, you could either go with Quo's idea of giving them medical supplies, or go with Nyx to deceive them into trusting you. In order to save Quo from Bertrand's clutches, you can either go with Zeke's idea of freeing the cops, or Nyx's plan to destroy the plantation with a tram. This makes the karma system more engaging because it gives more replay value. You'll always want to come back in a second playthrough to see what mission you might have missed out on. Unfortunately, the decisions leave very little consequence throughout the story. I might even go so far as to say that inFamous 2 only gives an illusion of choice. Whether you choose to expose Bertrand of what he's doing to the New Marais population, or team up with the monsters, the story plays out exactly the same. Here's what I think could have given more weight to these choices. Say you decided to go with Nyx's plan of blowing up the plantation. The result could have changed. Instead of Cole going in there to free Quo from her shackles, she could have been knocked out by the explosion, nearly killing her. This would not only cause Zeke to chastise Cole for going with Nyx's decision, but would also leave Quo permanently disabled because the explosion would have injured her. Like, I appreciate the fact that karma choices provide different experiences, but Sucker Punch didn't take the extra step to make it feel like I was going down a diverging path. It kind of feels like the path diverges at first, but then eventually rejoins into one main road. I kind of compare the karma system to the choices you make in Heavy Rain. Nothing you do really carries any form of consequence. You can't even mix up the choices. There's no middle lane. Alas, purple coal was the reality we were denied. Because, red and blue make purple. You get the point. Now, thankfully with the powers, there's more of a difference. Granted, they tend to be more hit or miss. First of all, I do appreciate the fact that it's easier to switch powers with the extra real-time menu. There's a lot of criticism with how you need to perform a stunt to get powers, but for me, it's functional. Now on to the actual powers. Even though the initial stages of Cool's good version of the Electric Blast are mid, the final version manifesting itself to be the Bolt Stream is one of the most effective abilities to use. Basically, you can sit back and get stoned while you hold down the trigger button to unleash a stream of rapid-fire bolts. On the other hand, the Ice Launch is very good for traversal. It allows Colt to propel himself into the air to get onto higher ground. Especially in an open-world game like inFamous, this makes traveling a lot faster because it allows Colt to cover more ground compared to running all the time. These two powers make the good playthrough feel better to go through. In the evil playthrough, you have things like Nyx's dash attack, which only covers a minimal amount of space. Technically, you can use it to defeat enemies, but you'll find that just shooting at them is more convenient. On the contrary, the Punch Blast is very effective because of how it causes an explosion, which can take out multiple enemies at once. However, it doesn't feel as stimulating as the Bolt Stream. That's not to say that the evil playthrough isn't worth it at all, for you have a lot of freedom in basically being able to kill everything that moves. inFamous 2 also brings back the good and evil side missions. However, the approach has been reworked a little. While there still are a lot of standalone missions, some of these try to tell some kind of story. In the tasks where you have to help an ice soldier, you get to observe as he progressively loses sanity. Initially, he starts off as a simple defective that didn't want to go along with what the others were doing. However, with each subsequent mission, he started to evolve, which showed that even the ones who were good in nature were not immune to their status as artificial conduits. By the time you have to kill him in the final mission, it feels like a tragedy because all this time you had fought by this guy's side only to watch him lose his mind. Unfortunately, that didn't seem to be the case with Quo, for she didn't give much of a shit.
Insane as he was, I think he was glad we were there to stop him.
The heartless bitch. For the evil side missions, there's a set where you have to help out an assassin. Supposedly there's something shady about him, but he doesn't do anything suspicious until the final mission, so there could have been more of a build-up to his betrayal. The guy leads you into an ambush with some of the ice soldiers, and Nyx manages to catch him, which finally allows you to get the chance to finish him off. These story-based missions are few and far between, and I wish all the karma-based side quests were like it. The only other karma side mission I found intriguing was Past Decisions, in which you meet a woman from Empire City that either kisses you if you're good, or tries to murder you if you're evil. Why couldn't there be more missions like this where the NPC interaction is different? It would have created a more interesting dynamic with the karma decisions. The main karma missions suffer from their own tediousness. Delivering medical supplies for Quo amounts to nothing more than the worst type of task, the escort mission. Fooling the rebels with the Nyx involves you doing a turret section, which is already self-explanatory as to why that's bad. Some of them have their pros and cons. Escorting a tramp to the plantation is annoying because you can't go too fast. However, you get the luxury of having Nyx by your side to aid you in combat. On the other hand, freeing the cops isn't too difficult or involved, but they make for some crappy party members to assist you in breaking into the plantation. And while we're on the topic of crappy AI, let's talk about some of the enemies. One of the things that really stuck out like a sore thumb is that inFamous 2 either likes to pit you against crowds of foes, or make you fight against a giant that without mercy loves to knock you back. There were so many instances where I died and couldn't help but wonder, why am I constantly losing in these situations? You'd think that Cole would have the necessary powers to combat any foe, but I soon realized that there are certain enemy characteristics that make these fights have an extra layer of difficulty. The Devourer is the best example. There's only one weak point you can exploit, since the rest of his body is covered in armor. The thing is that this particular area is his mouth, which is where he fires his globs of destruction. Basically, you only have a second to react before getting pelted by acid, and you can't get too close to him either, otherwise you risk the factor of getting eaten alive. Sadly, the only way to fight the beast is to run away from it, and shoot at it while looking for its weak spot and keeping a safe distance. Sounds like too much to process? It sure as hell is. Seriously, I dreaded having to fight the Devourer in each playthrough. Fighting the Corrupted also proves to be difficult because they will hit you out of a combo and knock you back. The melee has improved with the inclusion of the amp, but that doesn't mean the enemy behavior cooperates. Especially when you're trying to fight them in a group, the Corrupted just bat Cole around like a bouncy ball. The thing is, the Corrupted will only stagger based on melee abilities, so unless you have an ionic charge to spare, these guys will be a pain in the arse because you're always forced to get close and personal with them. Another issue is that this game tends to place you in situations where waves of enemies surround you, and there's not much you can do about it. This is especially the case where Cole needs to activate the substations. Enemies are literally pouring from all angles, and Cole doesn't have a toolkit to deal with all of them. Again, if you're lucky, maybe you'll get an ionic charge to unleash a vortex, but for the most part, Cole was never designed to take out so many enemies at once. But besides these design flaws, the city of New Marais is teeming with life. While a lot of the NPCs are mostly the same and don't do much, there are reports from US TV News that broadcast the plague and the beast's actions. I like how it's featured to the small screen on the top right corner instead of being forced to look for a TV station. In the last report, she literally breaks the fourth wall and says that because the pandemic was getting so bad, she wanted to take some time away from reporting and to spend more time with her family. It then cuts off mysteriously. It's just so abrupt that it makes you wonder about the true nature of the station. Bertrand also spouts his own propaganda via the television station. It's funny how there are certain side quests that involve Zeke hacking into the stations to change the channel. One of them has him change it to one of those old 50s cartoons. I'm honestly not sure what this is. Another one has him try to attract Cole to some ladies. For every playthrough that I do, I always make it a requirement to do this mission because it always cracks a smile on my face. Moments like these really carried me through a lot of the hard life situations. As someone with few friends, Cole and Zeke represent the ideal friendship, which makes the endings all the more heartfelt. So yeah, there are two completely different endings for inFamous 2, and both of them really pull at your heartstrings. The good ending involves Cole using the RFI to cure the plague, which wipes out all the Conduits in the process. This concludes with him being looked up to as a martyr and becoming the patron saint of New Marais. When I first played this, I remember my jaw dropping at the literal prospect that Cole had just died. Like, they actually went there. Of course, Zeke's final words to Cole also made me emotional. Ultimately, Conduits and humans aren't too different from one another, and Zeke himself is living proof that there is a bond the two types of people can share. For the evil ending, it kind of feels a lot more involved. You get to go rampaging across New Marais with the beast. Nyx tries to stop you, but she's nothing more than a little fly that can be swatted away. There's a boss fight, and honestly, I can't quite wrap my head around the brutality behind the way the game has you kill Nyx. Cole literally knocks her down and charges her with 1,000,000 volts before the game pauses on her crestfallen face. I repeat, the game pauses at the shot of Nyx's dead face. Let that sink in. But ultimately, the real emotional gut punch comes from the final moments of gameplay. You either have to hold down the shoulder buttons before releasing so that Cole can activate the RFI before dying, or slowly zap Zeke to death. In both moments, you're basically frozen. You just simply can't bring yourself to do what the game is asking of you because it's just so painful. Throughout both the first and second games, you've grown to care for these characters, and it just wouldn't be right to off them just like that. And maybe that's the reason why I hold inFamous 2 in such high regard. Besides the polished gameplay and atmospheric setting of New Marais, the characters and story have such a high emphasis. From the strong bond between Cole and Zeke to the philosophical questions of saving the few or the many, inFamous 2 is filled with subtleties, and that keeps making me come back. So even with the drawbacks that I brought up, inFamous 2 is still superior to its predecessor and is quite possibly one of the best games I've ever played. Now, one of the big questions people like to ask is, should there be an inFamous 3? After all, people like to say both endings left it open. It gets even more interesting that the evil ending was supposed to be canon, so what we were supposed to get in Second Son was Delsin fighting evil Cole as the Beast. Well, to be honest with you, considering the direction Second Son actually took as a result of Sucker Punch realizing more people did the good route first, there kind of isn't room for a proper follow-up to inFamous 2. Plus, I'd say that the endings were vague in nature. There were some open-ended elements like the question mark at the end of the good ending, but honestly, the truth of the matter is that Cole is dead. Plainly and simply. If you brought him back, it'd be all kinds of MCU levels of banana bullshit. So, The inclusion of a third game would have ruined the perfect note the second game left on. Who would know how Infamous 3 would ruin things? Granted, Second Son kinda takes the crowning achievement for that.
Golf clap? Golf clap.